There were always whispers, whispers that drifted through stone corridors like smoke, curling into the ears of kitchen girls, ambassadors, visiting dignitaries, and the servants who were paid to look away. In the eastern wing of the palace where the air grew still and colder, even in summer, there was a hallway lined in velvet, deep burgundy, always clean, always empty. No one passed through it openly. The doors at its end were tall and soundless. Some said they had no handles at all. The maids called it the widow's passage. Guards, when drunk enough, called it the chamber of ash. Foreign visitors spoke of a curious silence on that side of the palace, of footsteps muffled beyond normal, and of portrait paintings of beautiful women with rigid backs and lifeless eyes hanging alone on the walls. Each woman bore a slight smile, but never the kind that reached the eyes, and never more than one woman per generation. They said no one ever came out the same, or at all. It was not the kind of rumor that appeared in official histories. It was passed between chambermaids and tutors, whispered over needlework and late-night duties. The kind of tale you repeat only once, just enough to prove you've heard it, and never again. Not even in writing, for a palace famed for its ornate gardens and grand music halls, this wing was conspicuously absent from the royal tours. Architects studying old blueprints found entire floors missing from the plans, and once, when a foreign duchess took a wrong turn during a winter feast, she returned shaking, speaking only of a velvet silence that breathed. But the story of the chamber, of what happened behind its soundless doors, was not born from ghost tales or fairy stories. It was not fantasy. It was history. A dark, meticulous, chilling piece of history hidden within one of the most disciplined courts in early modern Europe. A place where perfection was enforced with precision, where emotions were seen as weaknesses, especially in women, and where silence was not just encouraged, was trained. At the center of it all was a king, a man whose court diaries were written in military script, who timed his ministers with hourglasses, who never once, in 29 years of rule, allowed grief to interrupt duty. He had seen his mother weep during exile, seen his sister cry when she was cast aside in marriage negotiations, and he had seen his first wife collapse, sobbing, when her newborn died in a winter cradle. He stood above her that night and told the midwives to remove her until she learned control. This was not cruelty for its own sake, at least not in his mind. It was survival. In his worldview, emotion was vulnerability, and vulnerability especially in a woman was a threat to dynastic stability. Tears corroded discipline. Mourning encouraged disobedience. And queens, in his experience, were most dangerous when they cried. And so the king built a system, quietly, carefully, a method of instruction, meant to preserve the dignity of the crown and the composure of its women. It began with whispered corrections in the drawing room, then long absences from court, explained as retreats for reflection, then, eventually, a physical space, a chamber where tears could be removed like stains, where obedience could be practiced, repeated, and perfected. It wasn't punishment, at least not on paper. It was education, refinement, purification. But the women who emerged, those who emerged, were never the same. What little evidence we have comes from fragments. A burned letter here, an intercepted report there, a half-erased entry in a lady journal. The roses are blooming again. She did not speak today. Her hands bled from the embroidery needle. Still, she smiled. And an ambassador from Venice, who once wrote in code to his cousin, "There is something wrong in the East Wing." The queen has been gone 12 nights. When I asked, they offered me wine and changed the music. The king, of course, never acknowledged the chamber publicly. He merely remarked that his fourth wife was of better composure than the others, and that her discipline reflected great promise for the future. She was 18. Her eyes were always red, but she never wept in public, and so the chamber lived not as a room, but as an idea, a chilling concept, half rumor and half procedure, enforced by generations of women who learned the cost of emotion. A velvet threshold beyond which sound faded, tears dried, and names were quietly erased from the family ledger. In time, the wing was closed off, not destroyed, not repurposed, simply sealed. The velvet carpet remained, cleaned twice a year by gloved hands. The portraits gathered dust. Visitors were politely dissuaded from exploring that side of the estate. The rumors never stopped, but they softened, like fog, over time. Yet history has a way of unsettling itself, of refusing to stay buried, even under velvet and silence. And sometimes, when you trace the outlines of a forgotten portrait, you find yourself staring into the eyes of someone who never stopped screaming. The story begins there, not with the king, not with the chamber, but with the women, young, bright, capable women, who were taught never to cry, and what it cost them to learn now. Let us descend into the walls themselves, into the place behind the velvet, into the echo chamber, where silence was sharpened into obedience. His name was not always spoken with fear. In his youth, the king was a boy with golden curls and solemn eyes, tucked away in a cold corner of the palace, while his father rode off to suppress rebellions and extinguish fires of dissent. His mother, once a lively French noblewoman, had grown quiet in the marble, holes first ignored, then abandoned, and finally sent away under vague accusations of hysteria. Her last act before exile was to weep openly in court, pleading for the safety of her children. The boy had been there, clutching a wooden horse, staring up at a row of unmoved faces as guards dragged his mother from the chamber. She screamed. His name, he did not cry. He never cried again. By the time he took the throne at 24, the young monarch had mastered the language of authority. He spoke in decrees, not conversation. He did not laugh. He did not grieve. And when his father died, the new king ordered no mourning period, a tightened schedule, and a revised military doctrine. Tears do not build empires, he reportedly told a shocked foreign envoy. Discipline does. His first queen was chosen for politics, not passion. A Habsburg cousin with pale hands and a gentle temperament, she bore the pressures of the court with a composed smile. But her body could not withstand the royal expectations. After 2 miscarriages and a stillbirth, she fell into despair. When their third child died hours after delivery, she collapsed into a storm of grief. Witnesses say she screamed for hours. In her chambers, inconsolable, delirious with loss. The king did not enter the room. Instead, he sent a physician, followed by a priest, and finally a quiet letter to her father requesting her removal. The queen died a month later in a secluded convent, of melancholy, according to the death notice. The king never acknowledged her again, not even in his memoirs. The second wife was younger, 18, dark-haired, and trained in statecraft. From birth, she never cried, not once. Her smiles were practiced, her words measured. She bore 2 sons and a daughter before succumbing to what court physicians termed a blood weakness. But behind closed doors, her ladies-in-waiting noticed strange behaviors. She flinched at the sound of footsteps. She avoided mirrors. and in her last weeks she was seen placing wax in her ears before sleeping. When she died, the king commended her for her dignity. He called her the ideal consort. It was the third wife who changed everything. She was not chosen by advisors or treaties. She was the daughter of a regional duke, originally intended as a political pawn for a rival house. But during a winter procession, the king saw her across a garden terrace head high, cheeks flushed from the cold, a book tucked under her arm. She did not bow. She nodded. The marriage was swift, unexpected, and frowned upon by his council. She was intelligent, outspoken, and far too fond of poetry. But she played her role well until her brother was accused of treason. It was a minor affair, little more than court gossip, yet he was executed within a week. The queen wept in public, not just at the news, but during mass, in front of the court, tears streaking her face as she clutched a torn handkerchief. It was the first time the king had seen his wife cry. Within days, she vanished from court life. The official explanation was illness, and servants were forbidden from speaking of her. The queen's private apartments were closed, her portrait removed from the main hall, and her name was quietly excluded from subsequent court records. Even the poet who had once written verses for her disappeared, arrested for sedition. Though no trial was held, behind the scenes something else had begun. For years, the king had toyed with the idea of emotional correction. The palace physicians, loyal and discreet, believed that certain female sensitivities could be trained away, like bad posture or cowardice. A chamber had already been prepared under the guise of a storage vault. It was soundproofed, windowless, and deliberately colorless. And in that space, the king's secret doctrine of silence took root. The third queen was the first known occupant. She remained unseen for over a month. When she reappeared for a diplomatic banquet, she walked slowly, her eyes dull but dry. She smiled faintly at the ambassadors. She did not speak. When a nobleman made a passing joke about grief, she blinked once, just once, but gave no other response. That night, the king declared her restored to virtue. No one ever saw her cry again. In the years that followed, the chamber beneath the palace became a quiet institution, selective, strategic, and always deniable. When new brides showed signs of melancholy, they were invited to reflect. When a duchess screamed after losing a child, she was taken to the east wing for prayer. It was all dressed in the language of healing. But the truth, whispered by those who cleaned the floors afterward, was far more brutal. Silence, the king believed, could be sculpted, and for the rest of his reign, it was. Women were taught to swallow sobs like wine, to nod during tragedy, to wear their suffering like a sash neatly folded and unseen. But there was a cost, and cracks were beginning to show. The next queen would not be so easy to mold, and the chamber was beginning to change, becoming less of a classroom and more of a crucible. What emerged from it would no longer be simply obedient, it would be broken. They were chosen before they even understood what they were being chosen for. Girls of noble birth, daughters of border dukes, distant cousins of counts and viscounts sent from the country, with the weight of family ambition stitched into the hems of their cloaks. They arrived at court with carefully rehearsed manners, fragile expectations, and the naive belief that their marriages would elevate their bloodlines and secure their futures. But the court had other criteria. The selection process was not publicly announced. It came in the form of invitations to feasts, quiet interviews disguised as etiquette assessments, and visits from observers. Older women who said little and noticed everything. These women watched how the girls responded to discomfort. Did they flinch when corrected? Did they speak first or wait to be spoken to? Did they lower their eyes, not just out of manners, but out of instinct? Behind these tests was a doctrine, but deeply entrenched. A wife must never disrupt the harmony of the royal household. A queen must never outshine or outfeel her husband. Above all, she must not make a scene. And so, the court looked for pliability, not intelligence, not charm. Those could be dangerous. They searched for girls who didn't ask too many questions. Girls whose smiles stayed intact when the room grew cold. Girls who could endure being interrupted mid-sentence without pausing to frown. Once marked as suitable, the training began. Officially, it was preparation, refinement, instruction in court decorum. But beneath the surface, it was something else. A quiet, systematic molding of behavior through subtle cruelty and psychological conditioning. One method was the mirror test. A girl would be seated before a gilded mirror and asked to recite lines of court poetry, while an older woman struck her lightly then harder with a willow switch. She was told to maintain her expression. Any visible twitch, any stammer, was met with disapproval. A perfect score was a steady voice, a smile that did not falter. Another technique involved the use of herbal mixtures, often slipped into tea without consent. These concoctions dried the tear ducts, dulled emotion, and induced a state of emotional vacancy. Soothing, they were called, but the result was a hollow-eyed calm, perfect for portrait sittings and royal dinners. Some girls grew dependent. Others began to hallucinate. A more insidious method came through embroidery and endless, repetitive task meant to reinforce stillness. Girls were ordered to stitch through their own mistakes without complaint. Bleeding fingers were not bandaged until the work was done. Each drop of blood was interpreted as evidence of weakness or worse, rebellion. And always there were the lessons, delivered not in classrooms, but in whispers from women who had already passed through the system. Elder wives, chamberlains' daughters, quiet matrons who had learned what it meant to survive the palace. They taught techniques to suppress crying, pressing the tongue to the roof of the mouth, pricking the inner thigh with a hairpin, holding one's breath until the urge passed. They spoke of what expressions were safe to wear on, which could mark a girl for scrutiny. The language of feeling was unlearned. Girls were taught not to say "I'm frightened," but rather "I am prepared." Not "I am sad," but "I am grateful for correction." Words became tools for concealment, not expression. All of this happened beneath a veneer of gentility. There were no screams, no obvious bruises, only the slow erasure of emotion, a transformation disguised as grooming. Some girls broke early. They were quietly dismissed, returned to minor families with vague explanations of emotional instability. Others passed their tests and were wed into the royal family or its orbit, praised for their grace, admired for their composure. But behind closed doors, their hands trembled, their dreams turned to ashdot, and yet the system persisted because it worked, because the court believed that a silent wife was a safe wife, that a kingdom ruled by poise was immune to scandal, that obedience, even when cruelly obtained, was preferable to chaos. But silence is never truly quiet. It carries echoes. It leaves marks, and the more girls who passed through this unspoken gauntlet, the more cracks began to appear beneath the surface. Behind every obedient bride was a legacy of pain. Behind every smile, the memory of a test. Behind every queen, who never cried, the ghost of a girl who once did. The system believed it could train silence into the body-like posture. But the soul, even when silenced, remembers, and soon one soul would begin to speak again. Not in words, but in the way she refused to disappear. It was never marked on any official map, not on the architect's scrolls or the royal registry, but it existed. Deep beneath the eastern wing of the palace, past a winding staircase no longer used, beneath a forgotten storeroom layered in dust, there it lay. The chamber, its location was traced not through royal blueprints, but through contradictions. A noblewoman's diary mentioned the sound of footsteps beneath her bedroom, despite no floor below. A disgraced physician once spoke of a facility for corrective measures, though he died in confinement before elaborating. And a single, tattered page from a steward's ledger included this cryptic note: Rose Hall's cellar sealed again. No mirrors permitted. Silence enforced. The chamber sat directly below Rose Hall, a part of the palace once famed for its floral mosaics and silken drapes. Above, the walls glowed with beauty. Below, the light never reached. Those who saw it described a narrow antechamber, followed by a series of windowless rooms painted in greyish hues, neither warm nor cold, neither day nor night. The walls were decorated not with royal crests, but with the faces of saints, but not joyful ones. These were the mute saints, obscure martyrs rendered without mouths, their eyes open in serene surrender. A visual sermon. Obedience is holiness. Silence is purity. There were no mirrors, none, not even a reflective surface. Women brought into the chamber were stripped not only of their jewelry and gowns, but of their reflections. This was intentional. Mirrors, the court psychologists believed, encouraged vanity and self-sympathy. To break the urge to cry, one must sever the link between the self and the face. The silence was total, artificially imposed. Guards padded their boots. Doors were lined with felt. Food was served without cutlery, so as not to allow even the clink of a spoon. But silence wasn't merely the absence of sound. It was enforced through presence. A presence that watched, noted, corrected. Enter the silence tutors. They were women always, women drawn from former courtesans, retired governesses, and once favoured ladies. Their reward for discretion had been a second life beneath the Rose Hall. They spoke rarely and never above a whisper. Their job was not to comfort, but to retrain, to remake each woman into a vessel of composure. Their methods were precise. There were the sobbing drills an hour at a time, 3 times a day. Women were forced to simulate weeping without producing a sound, not a gasp, not a sniffle. The goal was full expression of agony with no audible trace. Failure meant repetition. Repeated failure meant punishment, and punishment was a science unto itself. One technique involved prolonged exposure to auditory stimuli. Long, high-pitched wails played through a hidden device behind the walls. The noise was irregular, piercing, impossible to anticipate. Some women lasted minutes. Others endured hours before they began clawing at their ears. The goal was to make grief something external, numbed, distant. There was also the darkness treatment. Women were locked in complete blackness, sometimes for days, with only the faint sound of dripping water to orient them. Light, when it finally returned, came slowly flickering candlelight filtered through fabric. A tutor would sit opposite, expressionless, and ask only one question: "Do you understand now?" They understood. Meals were sparse and tasteless. Communication between inmates was forbidden. Those caught whispering were separated. sometimes left to sleep, standing in narrow alcoves, arms bound gently but firmly in silk restraints. Everything was just polite enough to maintain the illusion of care. But everyone knew this was not education. It was erasure. One surviving account, hidden in the margins of a servant's journal, described a noblewoman brought to the chamber for excessive mourning. She had lost a child to fever and could not stop crying in court. After 3 weeks below, she returned to her estate and was never seen at court again. But, in a letter later, seized and buried, she wrote, "They did not take my tears. They took the memory of why I cried." It was not only physical silence the chamber imposed. It was a kind of spiritual vacuum, a place designed to empty the self of emotion, so that the role of queen or wife could be performed without blemish. The body remained, the face remained, but something essential, the fire, the grief, the voice was extinguished, and yet the chamber did not always succeed. Some women emerged hollow but compliant, others broke visibly trembling, erratic, no longer able to maintain the facade. These were sent away to distant convents, to quiet retirements, or, in some cases, to smaller, less comfortable rooms from which no further reports came. Still, the chamber remained in operation for decades, never officially named, never publicly acknowledged, but the women of court knew, the girls training in embroidery rooms knew, and the queenzos who survived long enough to whisper warnings to their daughters. Best of all, the silence taught within its walls did not end when the doors were opened. It clung to the skin. It followed them into banquets, into state portraits, into bedchambers where they were expected to produce heirs with grace and without complaint. It made them flawless, and it made them afraid. But even in silence, memory finds a way to speak, and in the story of one queen who entered the chamber and returned with something unexpected, the silence would begin, slowly, to unravel. She arrived on a winter morning, swathed in silver furs and a carriage drawn by 6 white horses. Her name was Queen Constanza of Saluzzo, daughter of a mountain principality, born to snow and stubborn pride. She was not what the court expected, not delicate, not demure. Her Latin was perfect, her gaze disconcertingly direct. And when she stepped into the royal chapel for her first mass, the king, so long surrounded by silent women, watched her. Lips move with unapologetic clarity as she sang. Her reputation preceded her. Raised in a court known more for poets than protocols, she had once thrown a golden goblet at a bishop for insulting her mother. Her letters to her sisters were full of biting wit and political critique. When courtiers warned her of the king's distaste for sentiment, she reportedly laughed and said, "Then he will find my eyes most offensive." The early days of their union were tense but civil. She fulfilled her duties, dined when summoned, attended ceremonies, but she did not obey in the way the others had. She corrected the steward in public. She refused to dismiss a maid accused of stealing. And most damning of all, she wept. It happened in the inner courtyard. One of her attendants, a young girl from the northern provinces, had dropped a tray of crystal goblets. The king, passing by, ordered punishment, a single lash for discipline. As the whip cracked, the queen stepped forward. Her hands trembled, her cheeks reddened, and tears fell fast, fierce, unhidden. She didn't cry for herself. She cried for someone else. The silence of the court shattered like glass. Within hours, the queen was summoned. Witnesses say she arrived with her head high, a faint bruise on her temple from an earlier fall in the snow. The king did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His silence was sharper than steel. By nightfall, she was gone, escorted by guards to the east wing, beneath Rose Hall, into the chamber. 30-6 days. That's how long she remained inside. No one saw her. Messages were sent. No prayers were offered. Only once did a servant glimpse her shadow through a half-open door, slumped, hair shorn, eyes fixed on something invisible. When she emerged, she looked older, not visibly aged, but emptied. Her shoulders still squared, her spine unbent, but her gaze hollow. She walked beside her handlers like a queen in a dream, and she did not speak, not once. Not a whisper, not a nod of recognition, not a word of Latin, nor a sigh of protest. Silence had been carved into her, perfect, immaculate silence. The king, satisfied, announced that she had reclaimed her dignity. She was returned to her quarters. Her maid was reinstated. A portrait was commissioned, one of the most famous in the royal collection. In it, the queen is seated beside a winter hearth, her hands folded, her eyes unreadable. The painter later confessed that she never blinked during the sitting. Some believed she had gone mad. Others thought it a calculated choice to deny the court her voice as her final rebellion. Either way, her presence remained unnerving. Servants avoided her chambers. Children wept when she passed. Even the king began spending more time at his hunting estates. She bore no heirs. And when she died young, barely 30, the announcement was brief. No mourning period, no requiem, only a sealed casket and a closed-door burial. Her rooms were stripped within a week. For a time, she vanished from history, until the letter it was found decades later, beneath a loose floorboard in what had once been her dressing room, folded into the lining of a velvet slipper, its ink faint, but legible, written in Latin, in her unmistakable hand. It was never published officially, but copies spread quietly among historians, like a relic too fragile to expose. It began with a single line: "They taught me how to scream without making a sound." The rest read like a fever dream, fragmented phrases, flashes of memory, names of women never recorded in any court document. She spoke of drills, of weeping into cloth, of watching another queen scratch her own name into stone. But most chilling was the ending. "If I remain quiet, it is not because they have one. It is because I carry the echoes of all those who still cry beneath the roses." The ink smudged at the end, as if the letter had been folded in haste or touched by a tear. It was the last known trace of Queen Constanza. She had failed their test, but in doing so, she revealed the chamber's truth, not just as a tool of obedience, but as a factory of erasure. Yet through silence, she spoke more loudly than any wife who had come before her, and her quiet defiance would ripple through generations. The court was radiant. Gowns shimmered, like sunrise on polished marble, laughter polite, across banquet halls. Queens sat beside the king with perfect posture, their fingers adorned in jewels, their mouths curved just enough to suggest serenity. From a distance, it looked like a realm at peace, a kingdom of harmony, beauty, and disciplined grace. But behind the damask curtains and beneath the sapphire smiles, something rotten pulsed. Miscarriages became routine, though no one used the word. A minor interruption, physicians said, as yet another royal nursemaid burned the soiled linen in the dead of night. One queen was known to faint during court readings, always at the same passage, something about winter roses. Another stopped sleeping altogether, her eyes red-rimmed and twitching as she drank honeyed poppy each evening, muttering prayers she could no longer recall. They had all passed through the chamber, of course, that silent crucible beneath Rose Hall, where saints stared and tutors whispered. What emerged was not truly a woman, but something more brittle, more breakable. Their smiles had been lacquered into place, their thoughts wrapped tightly in wool and ash. Yet the trauma had not vanished. It had simply been buried until it began clawing its way back up. One queen, the fourth in line, was found at dawn with blood on her nightdress. At first, the guards feared foul play, but no one else had entered her rooms. It was later discovered discreetly. She had been gnawing at her own wrist. Not to end her life, but to feel something. Her confessor, silenced by oath, wrote only this. She said the numbness was too loud. Still, the performances continued. At every feast, the consorts were expected to recite verses. They spoke of loyalty, of feminine strength, of the king's divine wisdom. Each word was delivered flawlessly, each pause rehearsed, but court diaries tell a different story. In one, a chambermaid describes hearing a group of women huddled behind the altar, murmuring in broken Latin something like a litany, a survival pact. In another, a foreign envoy notes how the queen's hand shook while pouring wine, though her smile never wavered. The dreams were the worst. According to hidden journals, they dreamed of screaming dolls, of velvet bindings, of stairs that led nowhere, and of mouths sewn shut with golden thread. Several began to see figures in mirrors, women who didn't blink, or who wept silently behind the glass. At least 2 queens were rumored to have made suicide pacts, though only one succeeded. She died in her bath, wrists open, surrounded by rose petals. The official report called it a tragic accident of faintness and heat. And through it all, the portraits remained pristine. The court painter, a man of subtle defiance, once delivered a likeness of the 6th queen that was too honest. Her features were correct, her gown resplendent, but her eyes, they showed something raw, something human. They begged, not loudly, but unmistakably. The king summoned him. "This is not what—" "I see," he said. The painter bowed low. "It is what she showed me, sire." "Then paint her again," the king replied, "and make her eyes grateful." The revised portrait now hangs in the West Gallery. The eyes are serene, empty, obedient, perfect in public. The court was a tableau of divine order, but the cracks widened. Candles were found burned to the nub in locked rooms. Pages tore out parts of prayer books. One noblewoman attempted to drown herself in the baptismal font during a christening. Behind every graceful nod and polished gesture was the same hollow truth. The throne was built atop bones, some still whispering, yet no one spoke of rebellion. Not yet, not while the king lived, not while the velvet chamber still waited beneath the rose. She was born in silence. No cries, no celebration. The queen delivered her alone, attended only by women sworn to secrecy. The king had ordered it so. He preferred sons useful, moldable, blunt instruments of succession. But a daughter, though dismissed in public, could still pose a threat in private. Too many queens had whispered to their daughters in the dark. Too many women remembered. He would not allow it again. So the girl was raised behind lattice screens and perfumed drapes. Her world filtered through, scented quiet. Tutors praised her obedience, noting she rarely cried, rarely questioned. Her governess taught her to walk without a sound, to smile with her eyes, to listen more than she spoke. The girl learned fast. She learned what not to say, but silence, once broken, is never whole again. She was 9 when she slipped away barefoot, dressed in a robe stitched with sparrow feathers, and crept through the west corridor toward the forbidden wing. Rumors clung to it like mildew. Her nurse had whispered of it in fevered sleep, a place where queens learned not to bleed, not to break, not to be. Curiosity was not encouraged in royal daughters, but it lived in her all the same, stubborn as ivy in stone. She found the door, unlatched. The velvet chamber had long been sealed, or so they said. But that night, wind had blown through the cracked cloister, and the door had loosened. Inside, the air was thick like old perfume clinging to bone. There were no windows, only oil lamps dulled by time. No mirrors, no color. The walls were flaking with age, but still bore the ghosts of painted saints, their mouths nothing but blank smudges. On the floor lay the detritus of forgotten women, a broken comb, a bloodied veil, scraps of ribbon still bearing the scent of rosewater and fear, and something else, something that froze her breath, a message, scratched into the stone beneath the cot. She told me not to scream, but I did. I still do. The girl did not scream, but she did not forget. Years passed. She became the king's shadow daughter, rarely acknowledged, but never truly dismissed. The court praised her grace, her composure. They called her the silent bloom. But behind her eyes, something sharp glittered. At 15, she taught her maids to write a small defiance, quickly punished. One maid was dismissed, another vanished entirely. The girls said nothing, but she began to keep her own journal, hidden inside a prayer book at 17. Her tutor, an elderly scholar with trembling hands and soft eyes, collapsed in the garden. A stroke, they said. Unfortunate, but expected. The princess knelt beside his body, took his cold fingers in her own, and wept openly. It was the first time anyone had seen her cry. Servants gasped. A steward dropped his tray. Somewhere, a nun crossed herself in horror. The king's guards reported the event within the hour, but no punishment came. Not then. Not immediately. Still, the message was clear. The princess had remembered something she was never meant to know, and others noticed. The laundress who once stitched bloody sheets began leaving white ribbons on the chapel pews. A former silence. Tutor smuggled a page from the old chamber's records into the girl's writing desk. Maids began humming songs in minor keys, lullabies their mothers had sung before obedience took hold. One queen, long thought incapable of speech, muttered the girl's name in her sleep. 3 times small rebellions, gentle, deliberate, like cracks in glass. But the court did not tolerate memory. Not truly. The princess's horse was found lame, one morning, tendons sliced. Her food was twice delivered late. Her lady-in-waiting was replaced by a more suitable woman, younger, colder, with skin like stone. A letter arrived from the king's steward, praising her decorum, but warning of the dangers of sentiment. And then her mother, the silent queen, was moved from her rooms. Officially, it was for her health. But no one saw her again. The girl said nothing for a week. Then she did the unthinkable. She wore red to chapel. Red, the color forbidden to all unmarried royal women, the color of martyrdom, of bleeding saints. She knelt at the altar with her head held high, her lips parted not in prayer, but in defiance. The whispers returned, louder than before. She remembers, they said, and she's teaching others how. The king summoned her. But the doors to the audience hall remained shut that day. No one saw what passed between them, only that, when she emerged, her cheeks were dry, her eyes like glass. That night, the bells tolled 13 times. Something had shifted, not broken yet, but bent, ready to snap. The chamber still waited beneath the rose, and this time it remembered her name. It began with a cough, soft, almost polite, barely worth noting, but in a court trained to hear everything through silence. It was a scream. Within a week, 2 courtesans lay dead. By the end of the month, the sickness had threaded itself through the palace halls like silver smoke. No prayers helped. No physician dared speak the word aloud. Plague carried power, naming it might summon more. The velvet wing was struck first. The older queens, kept in shaded antechambers, with weak lungs and starved hearts, perished quietly, obedient even in death. The king did not mourn them. He did not visit their bodies. He simply ordered new tapestries hung to mask the smell. But the disease did not obey commands. It seeped under doors, into soup bowls, through the seams of silk veils. Maids collapsed while drawing baths. The steward was found foaming at the mouth, eyes open, lips bitten through. Still, the king refused to flee. To run would be to admit weakness. Instead, he gave a new order. No sound may be made in my presence, not weeping, not praying, not coughing. Silence would be preserved, if only through death. His newest wife, barely 16, untrained, still learning which way to bow, lasted 3 days. They say she choked on her sobs, clutching a lock of her mother's hair sewn into her bodice. She died on the red-carpeted stairs, teeth clenched, eyes bulging from the effort of not screaming. He did not bury her. He had her burned, her ashes scattered in the rose garden, the same garden where, years ago, a little girl once wept beside her fallen tutor. But that girl was gone now. The princess, the last thread of memory in a palace built on forgetting, had vanished. Some said she escaped dressed as a serving boy. Others believed she took her own life in the old chapel, under the gaze of eyeless saints. The truth was never found. Only that her name, once whispered in rebellion, was now spoken only in mourning, with no heir, no queen, and the court reduced. 2 trembling whispers the king unravelled. He forbade clocks from chiming. Musicians were exiled. The birds in the garden were caught and caged, their beaks bound with thread. Even footsteps became dangerous. 1 soldier, coughing in the wrong corridor, was beaten to death for audible disobedience. And still the silence thickened, no longer sacred, but septic. Then came the night the chamber was found. Flooded water trickled from beneath the velvet wings' sealed doors. A maid, fetching linens, screamed when she saw rats swimming through cracks in the marble, their slick bodies fleeing a darkness even they could not endure. When the doors were forced open, the air that rushed out reeked of decay and rose oil. The velvet drapes were black with mold. The portraits of silent saints had peeled from the walls, curling like dead leaves. The once sacred training chamber had become a tomb, its beds mildewed, its chains rusted, its silken masks floating in stagnant water like drowned faces. No one claimed the flood. No one knew what burst, what dam gave way. Perhaps it was the weight of memory. Perhaps the building itself, like the women who once filled it, had grown tired of obedience. The king did not speak of it. He stopped speaking at all. They found him days later, seated on the throne in full regalia, a dried garland of rosemary twisted around his wrists. His mouth was sewn shut not by cloth, but by his own hand. A needle was still clutched between his fingers. In death, as in life, he demanded quiet, and he got it, but silence. Once worshipped had become rot. The velvet empire collapsed in whispers. Servants fled, walls crumbled. The rose garden turned, wild, overgrown with thorns. The marble halls echoed not with songs or speeches, but with the slow drip of water through cracked ceilings. Only one room remained sealed, the chamber below the rose hall, now silent in a new way, not reverent, abandoned. It was dust that gave it away. Centuries after the palace fell to ivy and ruin, a stone annex behind the old chapel was reopened during restoration. Most assumed it held mouldy account, books, grain tallies, weather logs, nothing of value. But behind a false wall, stacked with mildewed ledgers and bound in cracked red leather, lay a journal, no name on the spine. No title, just a pressed rose, browned with age, tucked between the final pages. The handwriting was tight, nearly frantic, written by someone who had seen too much and was trying not to remember. The first entry was dated 2 years before the plague. The final one was a list, a floor plan, a list of names, a chart of punishments. Then, scrawled beneath in hurried ink, "Do not let them forget what silence cost." The journal described the chamber, room by room. The saint's hall, the soundless cell, the instructor's gallery, where women were forced to perform expressions of grief with their mouths closed, their eyes dry. It wasn't just words. Pressed between the pages were faded sketches. A punishment chart detailing 7 levels of disobedience. One involved soaking the tongue in vinegar and ash. Another required standing blindfolded for 3 days, while recordings of wailing women played on a loop. The discovery was turned over to forensic historians. They scanned the ruins beneath what had once been the Rose Hall. In the plaster, they found tiny fragments lodged deep in the mortar. Human fingernails, torn off not by tools, but by panic. A velvet scrap was recovered from beneath a collapsed support beam, blackened but intact, preserved in a resin case. It was sent for chemical analysis. The results returned: traces of laudanum, crushed glass, blood proteins. The cloth wasn't just ceremonial, it had been used. The historian who first opened the journal was interviewed for a documentary. He began explaining the significance of the chamber's floor plan, how each quadrant aligned with punishments, and then stopped. His voice cracked. He turned away from the camera and wept not just for what was found, but for all the voices that had been stolen before they could speak. Today, the palace stands restored, gilded, gleaming. Schoolchildren wander its halls with tour guides. Couples pose for photos beneath vaulted ceilings. The eastern wing, once sealed for renovations, is now open to the public. It houses paintings, dresses, a display of court instruments labeled symbolic ritual objects. But the air is wrong. Visitors whisper about it online threads, titled "The Cold Room Near the Rose Window," or "Why Did I Cry There?" Some say they felt dizzy. Others describe a pressure in their ears, as if submerged underwater. One tourist swears she heard a lullaby with no discernible source. The staff blame bad wiring, old ducts. The museum brochure calls it atmospheric. Still, complaints trickle in. One excavator, long since retired, once spoke anonymously to a local paper. He claimed the portrait of Queen Edessa's third wife, presumed to have died childless, was removed for restoration. Due to an unexplained stain, a stain shaped like a tear. It reappeared after cleaning. twice. Eventually the portrait was quietly moved to a storage vault and replaced with a replica. When asked, the museum denied it ever happened. Behind the display curtains, sensors installed for humidity control sometimes spike for no reason. On a recent night, a motion detector activated at 3:16 a.m. Security footage showed no movement. Only velvet drapes swaying though the windows were shut tight. The museum guidebook never mentions the chamber. It's not in the audio tour. There's no placard, no map marker, but if you stand just beneath the arch where the rose crest is carved, and you close your eyes, you might feel it, the hush dot, the kind that isn't quiet, but waiting. It begs the question no historian can answer. When silence is enforced, brutal, relentless, soaked into walls and memory, does it ever truly vanish? Or does it ferment, grow heavy? And one day, when the rooms are filled with laughter again, does it push back through plaster and portrait, velvet and velsoft at first, but insistent? Because pain may be buried, but it does not forget, and some echoes don't fade. They wait behind curtains,